Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
You got a little animated there. It was
I
exciting.
am a cartoon.
As always, we want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, Mr. Animated Man, you're up this week. What are you bringing to the table today?
I'm bringing an article from Scalawag magazine called Sci-fi, Fantasy, and Fascism by Sherronda Brown.
Yes.
And it's a fascinating critique of the ways that imagination and fantasy get used by white supremacist worldviews, and fascists, to advance outrageous and outlandish, literally outlandish, lines of thinking.
Yes.
They write about manifest destiny, some conspiracy theories about how the Fourth Reich will rise again from the hollow core of the earth. What?
Yeah.
And how there was an alien race of people who came before the indigenous people on this continent because the things that were found could not have been made by the indigenous people. So there must have been some advanced white alien people who came before.
Outlandish.
Literally. See? Now the joke comes home.
There
full
it is.
circle. And there's more too, but I think they set up their point well toward the beginning of the article. They're talking about Donald Trump and how he is interested in pursuing, quote, our manifest destiny into the stars, which he says during a speech. I forget the context of the speech, but he says it during a speech like 3 days into his, after his inauguration. And Sherronda says, quote, the objective truly encapsulates the spirit of Western colonialism, imperialism, and capitalist greed, conquest and expansion quite literally to otherworldly proportions. However, it is not unprecedented. Grandiose notions evocative of sci-fi and fantasy have long been entwined with fascism.
Yes.
And they go on to connect the dots between how this kind of thinking inspires and reinforces white supremacists who consider themselves to be the height of civilization, so much so that maybe there's some kind of divine aliens sent to protect and rule over the planet, and therefore they have a right to do whatever it is they want to do.
Wow.
So
yeah.
They go into a lot of this in the article, and there's just so much.
It really
so
was.
much. But where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, first of all, that was a really good introduction to this piece. Well done. And I'll also say that Sherronda uses both she, they pronouns, so we'll, probably alternate there. But
I tried to use they because they came first.
They came
in their
first.
bio,
I saw that.
So
I just wanted to mention that. Yes. But yeah, I agree. This was a really great piece. I appreciated the connections that she made between white supremacy and fascism to fantasy and in truly the grandest sense of that word. And I think more importantly than that, the analysis and the reminder that we've experienced this kind of white supremacist fantasy before throughout history, and how that line of thinking and political action has shown up time and time again throughout history. And so to me, this piece was a really nice survey of all of that in a way, which was great, in addition to all the great things you talked about. But I think one of the big through lines of this piece is this point that Sherronda makes towards the middle of the essay. So she says, quote, when it comes to white supremacy and fascism, there is nothing new under the stars. And I think that's one of the lessons and points that's been hammered home really well in a lot of the recent pieces we've been talking about here on the podcast about fascism. And so, we can add this one to that growing list. The point here is that there's nothing new. We've seen this before. We've experienced this before. I certainly think that the ways and the methods of how this current administration is employing fascism might be slightly unique to the times we're in and what our country, what our society looks like our makeup and our values and all of that. But the point is we've been here before, and we know what we've got to do, and we know what's necessary to both imagine and fight for a better world than we currently have. And I think that's sort of a big point of this piece.
yeah, and it's not that nothing is new. I think there's ways that they're responding to the context, right?
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes.
And I think that all of the tactics are all repeated, but it's just how they sort of package it to use in their own
evil
agendas.
Yes.
And it reminds me of that Toni Morrison piece again, Racism and Fascism,
yes,
where Toni Morrison says that it's just the Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola marketing of fascism.
Absolutely.
So it's just it's just a slightly different package, but it's the same nonsense inside. So one of the points that Sherronda makes really brilliantly while pointing out the origins of the concept of manifest destiny that Trump names in his speech that's cited at the beginning of the piece, they say, quote, in the white supremacist imagination, white people are divinely ordained and therefore endowed by the Creator with the right to colonize the entire continent. Just like the Christo-fascist doctrine, which once justified the enslavement and torture of stolen Africans, the manifest destiny ideology is rooted in fantasy and bolsters the violent removal and destruction of native peoples, families, language, and culture.
Wow.
Which is such an insightful way to point out the real delusions at the heart of white supremacy and settler colonization.
Yes.
And how that's seeped into so much of the history of the U.S. when we look at all of the things that the United States has done, and even into today, the U.S. Army, the U.S. military calling enemy territory Indian country.
Yeah.
And that continuing just as another element of white supremacy and the evolution of Jim Crow into mass incarceration, that through line too. All of this exists in the context of this kind of white supremacist imagination and feeling like white people are divinely ordained to rule.
Absolutely. And I mean, you use the word delusions. I think that's spot on. I love that word.
Or as the kids say, Delulu.
Delulu, as the kids say. Yeah, look at you staying young and spry.
I am, yeah. I'm a cartoon, remember?
Yeah, that's right.
Cartoon would definitely say Delulu.
Delulu. Yeah, I appreciated all of their analysis around manifest destiny and how it's being employed by Trump. That was really fascinating. Sherronda also points to how Trump has signed this onslaught of executive orders, which I think, to be honest, you could make a connection between that shock and awe strategy of these executive orders to the concept of manifest destiny. But she specifically references the executive order to end birthright citizenship as a true and clear connection to manifest destiny, which I agree with. So Sherronda says, quote, dismantling birthright citizenship would make a multitude of non-white residents, even those native to this land, significantly more vulnerable to the threat of deportation. Yeah. The birthright citizenship of indigenous peoples has also been questioned by the current administration, and members of the Navajo Nation have even been detained by ICE in the increased aggression. This administration's ambitions are set on completing the original intention of manifest destiny, inching closer to creating the white ethno-state fascists have long craved. Even more, they intend to metastasize to worlds beyond our own. And I think that last part is huge there, right? The inching closer to creating the white ethno-states fascists have long craved. Like, that is what Trump and his allies and his administration and remember that blueprint, Project 2025, and all of his followers and white supremacists alike, like, that's what they want. They want our country composed of white, privileged, wealthy folks. I mean, think Musk here, right? And everyone else be damned. And they're going to do everything they can to make that happen. The way Trump has done that in so many ways has been through this shock and awe of these executive orders that, many are being questioned in the courts. But that's exactly what they want to happen.
Yeah, and it makes me think of some of the earliest supporters of Trump were David Duke.
Oh, yes.
Former
Wizard
of the Klan.
Yes.
And, as soon as somebody like David Duke endorses you, you really got to pause and think about whether or not this is somebody I need to be aligned with. And so I remember when that happened in 2015, whenever that was, 10 years ago.
Yeah, wow. Yikes. Woo-hoo. Yeah, and look at where we are now, right? All those years later.
But I remember that happening and thinking, this has got to be the thing, right? And it wasn't the thing, obviously.
No.
And there have been many things along the way that should have been the things, and they weren't the things. And so who knows what the thing's going to be.
And again, 10 years later, here we are.
We are. So speaking of things, another thing that Sherronda mentions is this conspiracy theory about the Nazis that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So they say, quote, at the end of World War II, Adolf Hitler and a group of his followers escaped judgment by descending into the Earth's interior through a secret passage at the South Pole, where they have remained hidden for more than half a century.
Wow.
At least that's what some modern fascists and hollow earth conspiracy theorists believe. The Fourth Reich will someday rise from the depths. It's a theory fueled by occult lore that a number of Hitler's top advisors accepted as truth, and it's possible that even Hitler himself was a believer. According to the legend, the Earth is not only hollow, but also home to an ancient master race descended from extraterrestrials who use supernatural force to sustain their subterranean empire. Many generations ago, the superior beings who emerged from the depths to pursue a life on the surface ultimately begat the Aryan race. So this is nuts.
Yes.
And I hadn't really heard any of this before. Did not know that this was something that people believed.
Right.
But it's so hard to fathom. It's flat Earth times 10.
On steroids. I mean,
it's wild.
Yes.
I don't know what else to say about it. It's just so stupid.
Yeah. There you go. That's something to say about it.
Yeah, but I don't have anything else to say about it.
It's interesting when I read it, what it did for me was reinforce that it's in this article called Sci-fi, Fantasy, and Fascism, because to me it felt so not real. It felt so fantasy. It felt like it should be something that someone wrote in a book that's not real, that they imagined. But there it is. Yeah. They believed this conspiracy theory.
They still do. There's people who still believe it. They believe that it's real. There's people who think it's
right.
going to happen.
So I think calling it stupid is spot on. And it's truly at the depths of white supremacist conspiracy theories, for sure, I would say. I think that connects really well to another great piece of analysis that Sherronda makes in this piece. So she says, quote, considering how integral sci-fi and fantasy narratives are to white supremacist mythology and vice versa, it certainly follows that white audiences in a society that celebrates theft through colonization would want to claim ownership over these genres entirely. This, I believe, illustrates the fact that white supremacy is itself a sci-fi fantasy. Sci-fi and fantasy stories are not relegated to the screen or the pages of novels and comics. They are also created in the mind of the oppressor as a feature and function of white supremacy and fascism. In these conjurings, whether they be nostalgic longings for an idealized past or prophetic insights into the future, the insatiable desire for power is essential to white fantasy making. Yeah, I love that. And I think it sort of brilliantly highlights the absurdity of white supremacy and fascism, and that they truly are sci-fi fantasy and not based in the reality of our world and of our people and of our current conditions at all.
Yeah, and it's like the theory I just mentioned.
Right.
It's just finding these fantasy theories to claim ownership of power.
Yes.
And that's whether you believe that there are aliens that begat the Aryan race or not, the actual essence of white supremacy itself is a fantasy.
Yes.
Right? Like it is.
There it is.
It's made up based on the perceptions of white people who then said, "Oh, this must be true because look at this," versus look at, and it's these comparisons that were made that are based on the shallow thinking of whatever, deluded Europeans weren't taking baths in 15th, 16th, 17th centuries.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And it's the sort of carrying out of that in terms of violence and violent ideology and the like. So, yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, let's talk about application.
Okay.
So this is where we talk about how we can apply what we've learned from this article in our day-to-day lives and work. My application comes from the very end of the article. Before this, Sherronda tells a story about a Black Vietnam War vet named Corey Moore.
Oh, yeah.
Who went into a police department and took a police captain captive. He demanded an apology from President Carter for all the pain and suffering caused to Black people in the United States history, and also demanded that all white people leave the planet in 7 days and, I believe, burn all their money.
Yeah.
So Sherronda says this about Corey Moore. Quote, in truth, Moore simply asked if white people could use their various fictions to create our material conditions, our real-life horrors, why couldn't he do the same? Why couldn't he imagine sending white people to the stars and write their cosmic journey into existence? Why couldn't he write a fiction and have his fiction become a reality too? The mythology of white supremacy has existed for millennia, and Corey Moore simply felt it was about damn time we write a different story.
Come on now.
So this feels like a way to lay bare the absolute lunacy of white supremacy, the delusions of it.
Yes.
It highlights exactly what's so outrageous overall about the ideology.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. That's such an incredible story and a way to sort of, yeah, as you say, apply this to the lunacy of it all. I love that. I actually love that you brought up the Corey Moore story because I think it connects nicely to my application. At the end of the piece, Sherronda really brings the point home that we have to imagine the world we want and that we need. And so they say this. Again and again, stories indistinguishable from sci-fi and fantasy narratives are used to justify fascist endeavors and uphold white supremacist understandings of race, history, indigeneity, colonization, and the world at large. But we have also written our own stories in disruption of their fantasies. When the enslaved rose up and killed their alien abductors, as they did during Nat Turner's insurrection, or when black folks escaped plantations to build free, autonomous communities and plot rebellion in the Great Dismal Swamp, or traverse the Underground Railroad under a careful watch of Harriet Tubman. When Octavia Butler distilled her knowledge of the past into her parables to deliver a warning and prepare us for a future now unfolding. When Corey Moore served his eviction notice, each of these was imaginative resistance at work. In order to realize a better world, one must first imagine it. And I just think in the face of all that we're experiencing right now, there is no other option that we have than to imagine the world that we need and we want and to fight like hell for it. Just kind of full stop.
Yeah, exactly. I love the connection that Sherronda makes between all of these imaginations of a different world, of a different future.
Absolutely. It's brilliant.
Yeah. All right, let's talk homework.
Okay.
What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning beyond our conversation today? My homework is another article that Sherronda wrote for Scalawag almost a year ago.
Okay.
It's called The Southern Truth About Communism, and it was co-written with Tia Troutman. And it looks like a fascinating analysis of the connection between anti-communist sentiment and anti-black violence.
Wow.
Which we've talked about a little bit here on the podcast before, but looks like a great another layer of learning more about that history. But what about you?
Yeah, no, that sounds fascinating. You should bring that to the table sometime in the future. I was really intrigued by one of the pieces that Sherronda references and quotes in this piece. They quote quite a few pieces, but this one in particular is called Black to the Future by Mark Derry. And it sounds like it's all about Afrofuturism and the idea of how black people, the black experience in this country is connected to and even based in sci-fi and fantasy. And so I'd definitely like to check that out as my homework because it sounds like it would be a fascinating read.
Yeah. Black to the Future.
Black to the Future. Also, the title got me. So, yeah.
You think there's a DeLorean in Black to the Future?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A souped up
Who knows?
DeLorean. I love it.
Or Kendrick shows up in a GNX.
Yes, actually, there it is.
Yeah. All right. Well, great conversation today.
Yes.
About this piece
Great
from
piece.
Sherronda Brown. And Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yes, so I'm excited to be bringing a resource from the Catalyst Project to the table for our next episode. And I want to give full credit where credit is due. You actually found out about this on Instagram and shared it with me. And so I thank you for that. I looked at it and I was like, we've got to talk about this. It looks really great. So the resource itself is called A Troublemaker's Guide: Principles for Racial Justice Activists in the Face of State Repression. And the title alone got me, right? It sounds like it's going to be an incredibly helpful resource given the times we're living through right now. But the Catalyst Project describes it by saying, quote, "This guide discusses how and why the state uses violence and coercion to suppress social movements and how to resist it in ways that are aligned with our racial justice values. And so I sort of peeked through it. It's definitely written for white identified activists and leaders and organizations, but they talk about how it can certainly be used by other organizations as well, other activists as well, and they want feedback from those organizations. And there's helpful information and resources all throughout it. And so I'm really looking forward to diving into it and engaging with it and talking about it with you next time.
Very cool. Yeah, I am glad I found that. And
yes.
Looking forward to reading it and checking it out and talking about it here next week.
Here we go.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. And you know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.